here to talk about today. In light of the campaigns of Oscars So White and Time's Up, there's been mounting pressure on the film industry to rectify generations worth of wrongs in terms of what stories get told and who gets to tell them. And largely these necessary conversations have been centered around race, gender, and sexuality, but they haven't always included introspection at a class level. Today we're going to talk about ways to start those conversations and what we can all do as filmmakers, critics, academics, and programmers to encourage and facilitate a true intersectional working class cinema. I'm excited to introduce our panelists here today. Sitting next to me is Eli Daughdrill. He is a filmmaker and professor from Atwater, California. His feature film Faith is premiering at Indie Memphis. He's written and directed several short films, as well as a documentary about his brother and his life with schizophrenia called Jonas. He's also a tenured professor in the program he leads for the film program at Long Beach City College. He lives in Long Beach, California with his wife and their 2 boys. And then we got Tayler Montague. She is a filmmaker, writer, and native New Yorker. Her writing can be found in publications such as Fader, Little White Lies, Film Comment, and Reverse Shot. And last we have Jasmine Sanders. She's a writer from the South Side of Chicago. She writes about Black art, culture, and history. She's written for BuzzFeed, Lenny Letter, Vulture, and the New York Times. And so to start the conversation today, I kind of wanted to, center on ourselves for a little bit and talk about it's how rare it is for a filmmaker or a writer to actually sustain a living exclusively through this work. I've made films and I program stuff, but I mostly make a living working the front desk at a spin cycle studio in New York City. Right. I wanted to talk a little bit about how you guys currently make a living or how you have had to make a living in parallel to facilitate your work in film.
Where do we start?
You want to go?
Okay, I'll go. So I make a living as a professor at a city college. When I was an undergrad at San Francisco State, my mentor was a filmmaker named Britta Sjogren. And Britta is brilliant and determined, and I saw that, and she makes her films her way. And I saw what she was doing, and I said, that's what I want to be. Like, what she is what I want to be. And so I was going to figure out a way that I could teach while still trying to make films that I wanted to make. And so I went to grad school, took on a lot of debt to go to grad school, and knew so that I could have the credentials I needed to teach at the college level. And never had designs on living in LA. I always disliked LA, but also knew that there were film programs at every institution that surrounds LA. Everybody has some sort of film program in LA or around LA. And so I had a decent chat at employment. And so I taught part-time. After I got out of grad school, I taught part-time quite a bit, and then got really lucky and got a full-time gig at Long Beach City College. And that's how I make my living. But I think it's actually really important because I don't think people admit to the nature of this work is that most people don't make their living with this work. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that extends even to people who are, at levels where they're getting nominated for Oscars and those sorts of things. Those people are all making their living doing some form of advertising, working in commercials. I mean, that is how they pay for really expensive rent because they have really, really nice places, but that's what they do. I mean, they make commercials and then they can make a feature every 3 years or whatever. So I mean, I think, but no, we don't talk about it because there's like the fantasy of this notion of quote unquote making it. I don't know what the hell that means, but we have it.
I'm an around the way filet. I'm a working class shorty. I live with my parents. Yeah, there's no limit to really be made. Like I was in undergrad. I was working internships where I'd be there 3 to 4 days a week full time, and then I would have to go to class full time because I didn't want to lose my scholarship. If you have like under a certain amount of credits, you can't do things. And so I was like really grinding for a long time because I wanted to try to have some semblance of a career upon graduation. And I graduated in May, and I ain't gonna lie, the career looking real elusive from here. You feel me? But I'm trying to keep the faith like everybody else. I be freelancing, I write, I do a little bit of programming, and I recently made my first film. And so I'm hoping, thank you! So I'm hoping that can kind of be, I tell everyone it's like my baby, it's my proof of concept. I wrote it, I directed it, this is what I can do, and I'm hoping that it opens doors. But I kind of go back and forth between like, is it really possible for me to foster a career? And sometimes the risk doesn't feel worth the reward. I can really love a film, and I can write 1,000,000 words about said film, and that's when it feels worth it, when I feel like I can kind of put my voice behind something that may not be getting the criticality it deserves. But if I'm being transparent, like, you don't get paid a lot to write. It's maybe $100, $150 on the film side, you know what I mean? If I was writing long form essays for like major institutions, probably way more. But, I don't know, it's hard. I'm kind of rambling, but whatever.
Yeah. Similar to you, I come from a working class family, so I didn't go to college. I've just always worked. Like, I've had a job since I was 14. So I've never had the idea that like writing was supposed to pay me, because I've always had another job, but I'm also a very new writer. So I went to aesthetic school, and I was an esthetician for a while, and I was also a barista previously, like before I started writing more. And currently, I make most of my money copywriting, honestly, like doing copywriting work, and then I've been at a couple of publications, and like I didn't really like that, and so I do prefer as a writer to be a freelancer. And so I guess thinking of it as a vocation in that way, as opposed to my job. But yeah, I currently make the majority of my money copywriting, and then doing long form essays also. Yeah, I do agree with what Tayler said regarding feeling like just the state of media and publishing and movies, feeling like there is no money to be made. And part of it is, I think, depending upon like what your family situation was or what class you were from, kind of predicates so much of it. Like, if you have the money to take the time to write, like, I remember like coming to the realization at a point that what I want to write about is working class Black people and working class Black culture, but those people are working, so they're not reading, the shit that I put on the internet. Like, my mom doesn't, like, they don't have time. And feeling similarly as a creative, sometimes I don't have time either, because like what I'm doing is trying to make money.
Yeah.
As a copywriter and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think that kind of opens up the idea of like who has the privilege to have the time to develop their voice and work through it. I mean, I think there's this tendency in the film industry, because it is very difficult across the board to flatten those kind of experiences and just say it's hard for everybody, and that equivocates the struggles of the privilege with the struggles of everybody else. I think like why do you think, where does this like hesitancy to own up to one's privilege come from?
I think that it feels like a uniquely American, or maybe like generally Western affectation, to be really obscure and secretive about the money that you have and your exact class positionality. I feel like the privilege thing maybe, or especially or at least in this regard, when you're talking about like money and class and like exactly what your family does, I feel like that may be kind of an offshoot. It's kind of that obscurity. But I also feel like, I don't know that the privilege discourse is like technically like complex or nuanced enough to encompass like what we're talking about, If that makes sense. Like, I think it's much more complex.
What are some of those complexities that I guess would deepen that?
Well, one thing I was going to say, I think that's a really good point, and I also think that I don't think we realize how powerful the mythology of the sort of individualist, or how, like, if I'm successful, if I'm a successful filmmaker, like, it's because of my talent, my skill, my creativity, not the fact that I grew up with upper middle class parents.
Like the myth of meritocracy.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And so, like, to admit that like, so there's so many filmmakers that I like let's Noah Baumbach or the Safdie brothers or whoever, right? They grew up in a different class position than I did, right? And so they have clear talent and they have clearly something to say, but there is, to put that to them or to put that to any other filmmaker in their position, like, that means that they have to sort of examine that. And I think that's really hard in American culture for us. Even people who understand that the notion of the fallacy of meritocracy, like, if you're talking about your individual self, well, no, but I worked really hard and I'm really good at this, and I'm doing shit that other people can't do, you know?
Yeah.
It's also just a culture of it being impolite to talk about money. I mean, that's how I was raised. Like, you don't look at the next person's pockets, but some should just be obvious. Like, I can look at people and be like, okay, I know you come from a certain wealth background. I also think it's interesting in the context of New York City because there are these equalizers. Like, we all take the subway, we all go to the same bar, we all go to, like, so there's no kind of, like, real way to gauge until it kind of comes out, which I feel like happens a lot. Like, you'll be talking to someone, they'll be like, yeah, that dude's dad is, like, a hedge fund manager.
Or like the Christmas photos on Instagram.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, okay. You see their house, I'm going home for Thanksgiving, and then you see the island in the kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah, I really had, like, a moment recently where I realized, like, people whose careers I thought I envied and people who I thought were so much more talented and so much smarter than me were just upper middle class. Like,
Absolutely.
and so, and then, like, being here and being on a jury for a film prize, realizing that so much of what you consider a good movie, or, like, when I was looking through these movies and trying to figure out what I liked about them and which ones were good and which ones weren't, comes down to sometimes they just look expensive and the money that you have to put into it. Like, yeah.
And I think that opens up a little bit of what we were talking about early on about, I think, like, in critical spheres, there's so much talk about, like, what the films mean and what the content of them say politically, and not so much delving into the aesthetics or the craft or how, like, limitations of budget affect those creative choices down to even, like, what camera you choose to shoot on or how mobile the camera can be. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, in your work, how those limitations have kind of played out and, I guess, the, like, subtleties of class in your film.
Yeah, well, I mean, even my work, but, like, I can even, like, stuff that I watch or teaching students or whatever, I mean, there's, it affects the choices that you can make, like, where I can place my camera. Like, well, I can't afford a crane. We don't have money for a dolly. Like, one of the things Chris and I were talking about, we're shooting inside a car, and well, it'd be great to have a car rig, but we can't afford a car rig. So what does that mean? That means we have handheld shots from the back seat of the two characters talking in the front, right? So those can feel like, especially to a trained critic, those can feel like cheap aesthetics or film school aesthetics or that sorts of thing. But I mean, I think that's what, I mean, for me, when when you see a filmmaker who's working those limitations, but is not afraid of them, and is also, like, you had this question, you sent out an email earlier about films that we might talk about, and the first thing that popped in my mind is Killer of Sheep, Charles Burnett's Killer of Sheep, because it's such a beautiful film, but it is so unafraid of its limitations, and I mean, I will never forget the first time I saw that film, and the lead actor's name is going to escape me, but he has those guys over at his house, and they're trying to get him to come with them to do something sort of nefarious, and one of them says something about being poor, and he gets so offended by the idea that they would think that he's poor, and I'm not poor, and he shouts it out, like, it's both in its politics and in its production and its aesthetics, it's capturing something about those sort of class identities, I think.
I think interesting about what you're saying, real quick.
Go ahead.
I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that for me, there's this like also divide in the films that I engage with as like a critic and an audience member, where I feel like the films that I'm most profoundly affected by on the rep circuit, because I have the privilege of like living in a city that has a really healthy repertory circuit, are the least slick, the most kind of like low budget, older films that I get to see affect me profoundly versus the kind of very high quality, high budget, like Hollywood films that are happening. And I feel like on the ground, in a certain sense, there's kind of been a reckoning with that, right? That these, I mean, you see it on, like, on the discourse on Twitter, but like the Marvel movies, the Joker movies, all these movies that look really good, but in their content, you know, what are they grappling with? What are they seeking to say? So I do think that there's some, I don't want to say the tide is turning or anything, but I do think there's some like critical notion about like, just because it looks good, just because everything is hitting on a money level doesn't mean it necessarily is a good film, which makes me happy in a sense.
Yeah, and I think a lot also about just even in the content of some of the films that we're talking about that do on some level engage like class dynamics. There's clearly a viewership or an interest in the viewership of these films that delve into these topics, from everything like the Safdie brothers' work, Sean Baker's Florida Project, and all the way up to the multiplex of like even the Purge movies or Joker.
I love the Purge movies though.
Yeah, I mean they're really great, but I guess it's at the end of the day, these are very expensive films about poor people. And I think I'm curious to hear from the two of you, like how does that affect or paint how you read a text and explore it in your work, or like in the writing of the work?
How what does?
How like the way that the film has been produced, and the gulf between who's making the film and who it's about.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's something I think about all the time. Like who's behind the camera is just as important to me as who's in front of the camera. Because that gaze kind of shines through, like who are you to make this film about this group of people? I think there was also a panel here about like what is a black film, you know what I mean? And like, I mean, kind of circling to that, a film that I really like that I thought was a black film growing up canonically was like A Soldier Story, which is directed by like Norman Jewison. But to me, kind of, it feels like a collaborative effort because there's like an ensemble cast. And so the kind of like grappling with race in a way that feels like rooted in reality, grappling with class, grappling with like upward mobility, bootstrap concept is there, some of these themes in that film. It feels like, you know, there was an input on behalf of the black people who were in front of the camera. And then there's also films that like don't do that at all, and you can feel it. And then when I'm like, as a critic, sometimes I even ask myself, is this worth engaging with? Do I even write about this, right? Like just let it speak for itself. I'm not gonna waste my time and my energy pointing out what's wrong about it, because those things are felt by the audience. Like I know a lot of black people probably watch some of these films, it's like, okay, that wasn't for me, you're talking past me, and that's okay. And I'm not gonna give my time or energy or effort to write about it, like, I'm good, you know?
Yeah, I thought about it a lot with, I guess most recently with Call Me By Your Name, because all I could think about was this movie isn't this movie, and this movie doesn't get made if it doesn't take place in an Italian villa and in this beautiful home and in like a seaside village, because if you take that away, all you have is like something really uncomfortable happening between these men where there's a huge age gap, and if they were, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, I always think about how the class dynamic, even if it isn't portrayed, I'm thinking about it in a way, and sort of what biases are present, if that makes sense.
If I could, like you, just from the production side, and just thinking as a teacher, and since so many of my students are coming from, they're working class, working poor, I even have students who are living in abject poverty. And so one of the things that can, like, since we talked, Twitter was mentioned, we all live in Twitter. Christopher McQuarrie had a whole thread here, the guy who made the last Mission Impossible movie, about, he gets asked all the time how you make it and all this sort of stuff, and so he had a whole thread about his career and writing Usual Suspects, and then this kind of valley that he went through, and then sort of working his way out of it. And then I think it was Kyle Buchanan who said something about, well, what he's not telling you is that he was best friends with Bryan Singer, and Bryan Singer had made a short film with Ethan Hawke, and that's how Bryan Singer sort of got noticed. And so I thought that was really interesting, and because I'm thinking about this in terms of production and these connections to how you get to a certain place. But that, so you mentioned Sean Baker. I think Sean Baker is really, really instructive for people who don't come from those sort of connected places, because he started out making these tiny, tiny movies for no money. From that, and I mean, his working class interests, or the interests of the marginalized, like that stuff that sort of runs through all of his work. One of the things that I'm trying to do as a professor for those students, I mean, this is in Long Beach, which is 25 miles away from Los Angeles, but Hollywood might as well be thousands of miles away from my students, right? One of the things that I'm trying to do is make them feel as if this is possible. And Sean Baker is somebody like that, where I can go, like, oh, this dude was making these super, super cheap movies. And even, like, I honestly didn't really know about him until Starlet. And that's, like, I think, a $50,000 movie, which is a lot of money, which is beyond, you know, most of my students' means. But it was making, you know, 4-letter words, which I think cost $5,000, if I'm remembering right, or something like that. That is crucial for me, because I don't want them to feel like, okay, I didn't come from that, so I have no voice. And it's constantly about, you know, because I'll get the question, like, what camera should I buy? You know, the best camera that you can afford, and if the best camera that you can afford is the phone that's in your pocket, then that's the thing that you go out and use to make the film that you want to make. Because it can become, it can become oppressive, this idea of, I don't come from those classes, I don't come from these connected spaces where my best friend is friends with Ethan Hawke, and so then I'm never going to get to make the things that I want to make. And I think that's really important. I mean, getting the students to get over the hurdle of, like, not feeling professional. Like, well, that's one thing. Like, they want to feel like they're on the set and they got a chair that says director on the back of it, and they're getting to shoot, and their camera's an Alexa, and it's got the whole, is rigged out and everything like that. But so I like, because the conversations, that's just like my role as a teacher. Like, the conversations can get really depressing because it does feel like the entry point is never there for them, which may be the truth, but they want to make. And I think, like, that, the desire to make and finding ways to encourage them to make is, I think, the most crucial part.
Yeah. For the three of you, what were those moments that, like, initially made you feel like you could do this? You could work in film, you could be a writer. What were those things that kind of triggered that for you?
I never had any doubt I could do those things,
Yeah.
which I think is, like, partially how I was raised. I think I don't have a financial safety net by any means, but I think my parents worked so hard that they were like, I don't want to be in a position where I'm stifling my child from fulfilling the things that they want. Like, a big thing for them was always just, like, live within your means. Like, my dad would be like, if you make $5 a week, then you stretch that $5 a week, but don't go beyond that in your budgeting and the things that you want to do. So it was never really, it was really interesting, because I feel like I had all this confidence. I was like, okay, let's do this, let's go. Like, the world is ready for me. And all the other obstacles I face are less to do with, like, insecurity and conflict of self, but more so, like, getting out there and realizing, oh, this shit is not as easy as I thought, because I don't have the rich parents, and I don't have, like, a Rolodex that I was, born into or anything like that. So for me, it's been, like, a really, like, feeling my way through the industry, and I used writing as a tool to do that, because I knew, okay, like, I don't know anything about the film industry, but I know I can write, and so I signed up for a Critics Academy through Lincoln Center, and that was my first time, I think, at a film festival, and that was, I had, like, an all-access pass, and, I was like, well, fair exchange isn't robbery. They give my beautiful words, and in exchange, I get to kind of go to the festival and see what's going on out there. But that was really formative for me, too, because to be really, like, up close and personal with how things work, I was like, oh, okay, I think I like this. And I've just been kind of, like, trying to hack my way through, you know what I mean? And just kind of find these shortcuts and ways to access things that I've been in spaces where I'm like, my parents don't even know the half, you know what I mean? But that's what they wanted for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same. I definitely feel like the internet, for me, like I'm an incredibly new writer. I started writing, I think I said this already, I started writing like 4 years ago, in 2016. And so the internet was like the great equalizer for me, because like it was how I sort of connected with people who were both doing what I wanted to do and who had like a model for how I could in some ways. And not that it was perfect, because like even amongst like other Black people, like our class position just isn't the same. But I think for me, being on the internet in the late 20-teens was really formative, as far as realizing that there was some kind of way that I could eke out and like finesse my way into what I wanted to do. And yeah, I guess that's how I feel like I've just been finessing ever since. So.
That's good. Yeah, kind of on that note, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we talked a little bit about before, the role of like piracy and kind of like the clandestine ways in which we gain access to film history. And you were, Tayler, you were specifically talking about Bill Gunn's Personal Problems. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that as sort of like a formative film for you, both in terms of like the discussion around it, but also the way in which it was produced and kind of what the film is about, all of that.
Okay. I love Personal Problems. Like, you might have started something, Chris. I don't know, but like, basically it's like a soap opera type film about a nurse who works at Harlem Hospital. It's directed by Bill Gunn. It's like written by Ishmael Reed. It was made in a very collaborative way, just giving you the quick rundown. It also was shot on video, so it's kind of, you know, the cinematography is not HD, high quality, it's not clear. But it's still very beautiful, which I think is interesting, kind of like working within your means and things we were talking about, using what you have and, you know, building on those limitations in a way that feels really like valuable to the storytelling. And I think what I loved most about Personal Problems is that it's very dialogue driven. It's not really interested in like anything that isn't like a slice of life. I mean, it's a soap opera about this very specific woman in this very specific place. But what's interesting about it is that it did the rep circuit. It played like a Metrograph and BAM and places like that. And I wasn't able to see it there for some reason. I don't remember what I was doing with my life. But a lot of the way that I access movies and how I accessed that particular movie was like, I literally tweeted like, yo, who got that Personal Problems link? Because I just couldn't find it anywhere at the time. And I ended up getting shared on this like Google Drive with like dozens of other like filmmakers and people into cinema, and like, you know, ended up in an email thread where we're all like, yo, this shit is fucking amazing, this is crazy, like, and I just thought it was really interesting to me that this like deeply influential film kind of found its way to all these Black filmmakers that I know who are like, I want to build on Personal Problems, I want to make a Personal Problems, because they got it into like a Google Drive. And we were talking about like specifically piracy. Like I used to go get bootlegs at the check cashing place, or if I was getting a wash and set at the Dominican spot, you know, I'll have my fresh doobie wrap and then walk out with like, you know, the new Tyler Perry play or something. I don't know, but yeah, I mean that's the way I accessed movies most of my life. Was like my parents had the films that they liked, so I started there within that kind of like canon, and then from there I kind of worked my way out. I wasn't really a big internet film downloader. That felt very like hacking into the mainframe in a way. It didn't feel very accessible to me. It wasn't as obvious as LimeWire where you just like type in the song and it pops up. So yeah, I mean, I think piracy is kind of like an equalizer in some sense, and I know some people are really against it, and I think those people are the feds, like, you know what I mean, so.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's also really endemic to my movie-going experience, or like movie consuming experience as a young girl. Was like, I saw Set It Off on bootleg, and then the big thing was like, if you saw a movie on bootleg and you liked it, then we would go to the movies to see it. So like, we saw Set It Off and would like, this shit is amazing. Even though like you see like people walking back and forth on the screen, so it was like, okay, I gotta go see it without that. And then like within, I had one auntie who was like my kind of like more successful auntie, so she had a Blockbuster card, and we would do the thing that like we do with Netflix now, which is like everybody used her Blockbuster card, and then like obviously like now we got fees and she's angry, but like you know, and so like sort of consuming movies through those back alley channels were so formative for me. And like, I remember that's how I saw Set It Off. I remember that's how I saw Just Another Girl in the IRT, and these movies that are so dear to me. And it's kind of unfortunate, or I guess it makes me sad now that even with the streaming platforms, like Netflix has become super strict regarding who can log in at the same time, and it's taking like the communalism out of the movie-going experience, or movie experience, which is all that it's ever been about to me.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
for sure. Yeah, I wanted to kind of go back a little bit to talk about the barriers on discussion around class, just in terms of like how films get financed and how they're made. Eli, you spoke on a panel yesterday about the financing of Faith, the film that's premiering here. Could you maybe talk a little bit about like the way in which your film came together? Because you mentioned a little bit of there was some element of debt involved.
Yeah, there is some element of debt, yes. I'll be reminded of that debt for a long time. So I have a producer, Mike Ryan, who's produced lots of American independent films over the last 15 years. And he was able to, we thought we had found a significant portion of all of the money that we needed to make the film at about a $350,000 level. And then that money fell out. And so I'm left with this thing of, okay, now we're not going to get to make the movie, and this is a thing that I've been working for 10 years to do. And we had a little bit of investment. He was able to round up a little bit of investment, and we also did a crowdfunding thing. But to be able to actually shoot the movie, I had to take on a significant portion of debt. And in debt. And this actually points to something that Chris and I were talking about in terms of like the ability to do that points to privilege, like being able to take on debt points to privilege.
Access to debt.
Yeah, the access to debt. You know, I'm a tenured professor. We own our home. Like that home has more value than it did when we bought it, and so there's this play that you can have to be able to do that, and that is not available to other people in different sort of class stratas, right? And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not happy about it. Like this is not something that, but in a kind of reality of what most people face, that in and of itself is a privilege. That I'm going to be bitching about for the rest of my life while I'm trying to pay it all off, but it's a privilege nonetheless.
Yeah.
There's like a legacy of filmmakers raising money for their films or taking on. I mean, like there's that great Interview magazine cover with Robert Townsend holding all his American Expresses because he made Hollywood Shuffle over like a couple of years, maxing out his cards, or like Spike Lee selling socks so he can make sure he's got to have it. But what I think is interesting is that instead of kind of interrogating why that has to be a process in which films get made, it's become like a rite of passage. It's normalized in a sense, right? And so there's someone that's gonna hear your story and commend you and go, oh my God, but you still made that film,
Right.
which is great. But goddamn, you gotta be in debt to do it. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like, that part of things I think also really bothers me, and that there's this solidified kind of like pay your dues culture when it comes to class in the film industry. And a lot of people are, who have money, who come from money, are kind of moonlighting as like starving artists in order to kind of say, I went through it too. And it's like, no, let's just be honest.
Right.
Let's just kind of be honest about the sources of income and where the money is coming from. Because everyone benefits from that. Especially for me, like I made a short. The short was, made for a couple of $1,000s, and I had never seen that much money in one place. And so I'm thinking, oh my God, this short film is so expensive. And people were like, girl, that's mad low budget, like, by Hollywood standards, by filmmaking standards. And that's something I would know had I not had to like learn that the hard way, had people just been more open and transparent about what the facts and figures look like from this context, and why to me as a working class person, I feel like indebted for life to this person that put up the money, but then actually that's not a lot of money. And how money works is like also it's really sneaky. No one really talks about it. And it feels like a barrier to entry. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
Well, no, yeah, because like for a first feature, it's so hard to find investment. It just is. People who invest in movies don't want to invest in people's first features because they don't know if you're going to be able to make something worthwhile. And because no movies make their money back, or it's such a small portion of movies that make their money back. And so that, again, points to this kind of class thing where, like, these people explode on the scene with their first feature or whatever, right? And they probably got funding from Uncle Larry the dentist or whatever. He gave them $250,000, or the collection of the dentist syndicate all put in some money so they could do it. And so everyone else is left, I'm hesitant I tell the story, but I'm hesitant to tell it because for my generation, I'm a little older than you guys, which is made all the more evident because I didn't have this bootleg opportunity. I didn't have the internet like that, but whatever. But for my generation in film school, Kevin Smith blew up, and I never liked Kevin Smith's films. Whatever, you like Kevin Smith's films, great, but I never did. But here's this dude who financed his film on credit cards and went to Sundance and blew up. And the reason I'm hesitant to say this is what I did is because that was so bad for so many filmmakers, because so many people did that same thing, and then they just had a bunch of debt, and not this career where this sexual abuser takes you under his wing and like makes your career, the way Harvey Weinstein did for Kevin Smith. So it's also a really sort of dangerous thing, right? So.
And I mean, it's no secret that the film industry is like run on enthusiasm, and that, you know, people volunteer on set, they work for free, they work at festivals, or writers write like reviews for, you know, very low pay, and then they're expected to pipe down any complaints just because you're expected to be grateful for the exposure and the opportunity. You know, for those of us who don't have a leg up or who risk a lot just to like pay to play to be in the room, you know, how can solidarity be possible when this type of communication is almost actively thwarted amongst each other?
That may be the most
That's
depressing.
a good question.
That gets into the depressing part. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure. And also just the film industry is just so big. You know what I mean? Like, I remember, I forgot where I heard it. I heard it pretty recently, so it's sad, I forgot. But they were just like, there was like a tweet or something. I was like, after Brad Pitt's name leaves the screen, or after Denzel Washington's name is on the screen, you have all these long credits of people that helped and donated their time and did things, and they work in so many different departments. And so like, when you say solidarity, my first thing that comes to mind is like class solidarity, right? These people like unionize, these people get together in that sense. But I personally don't even know what that looks like on the ground, because it's just, the film industry is so vast. Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. That's something we should be thinking about. Yeah.
I mean, again, for me, like, it's that, like, making a movie with your phone is perfectly fine. Like, it's perfectly acceptable. Like, I think that, like, I always come back, I said this in the other panel yesterday, like, the most important thing is the making, whatever level that you can make it. And so, I mean, I think a way of achieving, because you can get, and I am incredibly cynical, and you can get so cynical, or the feeling that, like, I'm never going to be able to do this thing that I can do. And so, like exposing the reality of this, of how hard it is, and you don't have Uncle Larry the dentist, and you may have to take on debt, or however you're going to try to do it, and whatever means. I mean, so I make my students do a budget. They have to do budgets for they make a short film with me. And, you know, I'll tell them the range of costs that students before them have done. The most expensive film I've ever had made in one of my classes at a city college is $1,000, and that happened one time. Most of my students are spending somewhere in a range from $50 to $200 on a 10-minute short film. And I mean, the $200 ones are the anomaly. And so for $200, you know, once you try to get into a professional space, you can't do anything, right? And so but if whatever means that they have in front of them, that $200 and their camera phone, make something. Like, I think, because it can be, because of these things, like what we were talking about, like our individualistic culture and this feeling that you're floating out by yourself and there's no support system or anything like that. To some degree or another, they kind of have to embrace that and, like, I'm going to make my thing and go do it, you know? I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of repeating myself, I guess.
But in regards to getting that work seen, you know, from like a
That's what I was saying,
critical,
yeah.
from a critical standpoint and from a festival programming, you know, standpoint, what does it take for the $200 iPhone films to stand out against, you know, these multi-million-dollar independent films that are still considered small movies that shoot on Alexa with Cook lenses and all of that? Like, what would it take from like the critical and festival side?
It's interesting because I was at BAM Cinema Fest earlier this year, and I was on a panel about like being a critic, and this guy's in the audience, he's like, oh, like, I want you to write about my film. I'm gonna send you my film and you're gonna write about it. And I was like, no, I'm not. Like, first of all, ew, like, but second of all, you know, I'm a freelancer, right? So there's this kind of cycle in this culture in which I can't necessarily take the time to write about small films that aren't kind of being talked about on a word of mouth level, unless sometimes I get the privilege of doing a festival roundup. So if I saw this smaller film at a fest, I could be like, oh, like, hey, also this like little gem on the program was really good and I really loved it. But even that, I can maybe give it like 200 something words, right? I can't give people the like in-depth criticality that they actually deserve. Because of the way kind of media works and is set up for me as a freelancer. I'm not on staff, so I can't kind of wheel my position and write about a Joker and then write about something smaller next week. That doesn't work for me. But I mean, even that is predicated on programming. Because like I said, I see it as at a festival and then I can kind of write about it. But that's kind of how do the festivals program films, why that particular film. I mean, and so much of that is broken down by who's the programming team, who's a part of it. Do they see the value in this kind of story? Like, it's very complex, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I guess it's also important to me to not think of what's happening within media or within the film industry or in publishing as happening within a vacuum. Like, what's happening with film and media is just an offshoot and just representative of what's happening in society, which is this burgeoning gap between like the aristocracy and the elite and like working class people or working people. And so movie making and like this industry is just a symptom of that. You know what I mean? Like, it's occurring and endemic to every aspect of our society and the way we live our lives. And so I guess the ultimate and only answer is the destruction of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, 100%, yeah.
Well, the only other thing I would say is like, while I mean, maybe this is the wrong thing to say in a film festival setting, but I don't, whatever.
No, say it. Let it fly. This is the festival.
Like, the difference between being noticed on the film festival circuit and being not noticed on the film festival circuit is about like that. In terms of like the change to someone's like status or career, you know what I mean? Like, who won at Sundance this year? I mean, I'm sure some people know, but I like this notion that like that will have some significant impact. I think in some cases it might, but it's very, very rare. I think that again, this is just coming this is my position as a maker. The making. Like, if you stop doing the work because you're afraid no one's going to notice it because it's so cheap, then you've let capitalism win, I guess, to some degree, like, you know.
But I also think like we have to be real and talk about the realities of life. I don't necessarily have time. Time is money, right?
Yeah.
I have a certain amount of time on this earth, and I have to spend a certain amount of that time to make this bread, right? Because I need to live and I need to eat.
Yeah.
And so making is fun. In theory, I like to say that I have time to make, but we also have to be real about the fact that we do have a specific audience in mind, and we want to get it in front of that audience. And I don't think that's necessarily, I think it's more nuanced than just selling out and doing so. No, I know you're not saying that, but I'm thinking in terms of like, you know, like, that's something I hear a lot where people are like, just write that thing, just write that script, just make that film. And it's like, yeah, but in order for me to kind of chart a trajectory, there is some value in the fest circuit. There is some value in kind of getting eyes on it. I do think that in terms of class, there should be a conversation about distribution. I think we should rethink the means of distribution so that people who make those $200 short films on their iPhone have the same, you know, playing field as the person who makes the multi-million-dollar film.
How does that
of course,
happen?
but that's the conversation,
Yeah.
right? And that's why I'm like, we have to. I don't have all the answers. I'm not up here to give answers. I'm up here to contemplate with y'all. And so that's one thing that constantly comes back in my mind is like, how does distribution work? Even in the age of streaming, it's still very kind of classic, old school, big director gets big project that sits on Netflix. I don't know, like, I'm not gonna lie, like, there's a part of me that kind of likes the idea of just like dropping your film on the internet.
Yeah.
And just hoping that people see it and cultivating a following through social media and being like, yo, watch my shit.
Well, because that's the other thing about the film festival thing is that it gets expensive. Like that $200 that the kid put into their film, they don't have the extra money to drop $40 into all these submission fees,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
And so then throwing it up on Vimeo, and they're probably if they get some kind of whatever, that somebody links to it, somebody with a little bit bigger platform links to their film on Vimeo, that's going to get more eyes on it than, if they can only afford to apply to 2 festivals and they get into 1, you know what I mean? Like I think it's much more democratic.
I saw Zia Enger's My First Film, which makes me think about class and film and distribution. And when you walk into the theater, it's like a performance piece about her first film, which doesn't exist because it hasn't played a festival, which is like also talking about how festivals are like, not getting into a festival is barrier to entry for some people. But I was walking in the theater, she like airdropped me videos. And I was like, I'm about to just airdrop my film to people on the street. Like, there's a method of distribution.
Yeah, I think so. Another context kind of around this whole discussion that we're having is the somewhat like the reckoning that has occurred in Hollywood and the independent film industry to kind of correct wrongs that had been done in terms of representation on screen and behind the scenes. And it feels like there is momentum to greenlight work beyond just lip service. A lot of this stuff has been like personal stories and weird stuff, but also, in addition to that, there's been a sense that success comes when directors of color or women filmmakers, queer directors make like a big tentpole, like blockbuster. Make a huge film where the content is kind of already done by committee and it's work that already was going to exist. I think I'm just kind of want you guys to fire off like your hottest takes about this. Like
We on camera.
how successful and lasting do you see these industry shifts being, especially in the absence of like a class conscious dimension to them? Get us,
I think it probably, or at least sometimes it feels like to me like a really liberal, like equalizing, like, yeah, the movies are made by women, but there's still these like, like I saw Hustlers and I really loved Hustlers, and I had a friend who pointed out to me like it's kind of just like boilerplate like liberal feminism, where instead of the bad person empowers a man, the person who's like taking money and being powerful and like domineering is a woman. And I don't know if that's equality or like the equality that I want. And so I'm wondering if that's what's going to happen, is like we'll have like queer female overlords instead of like white male ones in that sense.
I think the I don't know. I don't necessarily like finding out that like my favorite director got a Marvel movie is like cool because I'm like, okay, get that bag. But on the other end of that, that's like that's 2-3 years they're not gonna be making work that's like not adapted. Or I was having this conversation earlier where I was like, this wave of Black filmmakers that are out here. It's been a minute since I saw like an original story. Like I love Ryan Coogler, but like he had like Fruitvale Station, Creed, then Black Panther. He wrote them, but the stories themselves do not come from an original place, if that makes sense, which isn't to do with discredit to him. You have Ava, who does like When They See Us, Selma. I think her last like original film was like Middle of Nowhere, which kind of put her on at Sundance. So for me, it's like the only way for there to be a healthy Black filmmaking, Black women filmmakers, whoever, I'm speaking specifically to them, but in general, is that there has to be like a mass amount of films being funded in that direction. There has to be diversity in the stories themselves because Black people themselves are diverse. So like, you know, for every bougie middle class, you know, rom-com or, you know, family drama, there should also be like working class dramas. There should, for every adaptation, there should be an original story. And it just feels like that's not like happening. I know everyone's like, okay, well, you know, your favorite filmmaker makes the Marvel movie and then in 2-3 years they'll make something, you know, a little more art house, a little more contemplative, a little more considered, but like, have they?
It doesn't happen, yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's not to like, I really don't, like I'm not someone who feels very strongly about Marvel movies. Like, you know, the Scorsese thing happened and people have been going off. Like, he's like, it's not cinema, and people are like going off. And I'm like, I really don't care. Let these people have their little comic book movies, but like, can I get something for me too? Like, damn, you know? So.
Yeah, I don't know. I like, just again, from the like filmmaking side, I'm thinking of, you know, I bet Ryan Coogler's got scripts and nobody wants to make them. You know what I mean? Like, you know, like I look, filmmakers and actors and artists, like they spend most of their time not doing the thing that they want to do, and then somebody comes up and says, "Hey, we really like that thing. We got this big tentpole, and here you go. What do you want?" And you get every toy, like so. I can feel that like how exciting that could be, or like Chloe Zhao. Like I love The Writer. The Writer is one of my favorite films of the last 10 years. And now Marvel's letting her play, and I understand that, like, you know, but I like how, I don't know, like look how hard it's going to be for Elizabeth Warren to get Medicare for all, like for us to like get, you know, like to all of a sudden open up this kind of class consciousness within our cinema. Seems like that it becomes this big thing. I don't know, the culture's got to get there, and I don't think the cinema can pull the culture there. The culture's got to get there, and then the cinema will open
Also,
up.
going to the movies is fucking expensive.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Like, so if I'm going to the movies, of course I want to see someone get beat up. Like, I want to see an action movie, baby. I want to see it all go down. I want to see the special effects. Like, really, if I'm paying $16 to $17 for a ticket, I live in New York, so I don't know how much it is out here. But if I'm paying $16 to $17 for a ticket, and then popcorn is like $50, and then a drink is like $100, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Adds up.
But
come on.
well, here's the other thing I would say is I don't think it's changed that much. I think once, to me, it changed in 1975 when the studios figured out how much money they could make off the teen audience with Jaws. That sort of changed their approach to what they were going to make and what they're going to sell. And so now, I mean, they're still making those movies for that same audiences. It's just now it's Marvel, you know.
Yeah.
I feel like this is the model we've had honestly for 40 some odd years. It's just now it's in, you know, everybody's got a cape on or whatever.
And similarly, like even the construction of the idea of a teenager, like it used to be that there were people who worked and people who didn't work. And so around World War II was when advertisers realized that, oh, there's this like middle group of people who have a little bit more money. And so that was like literally only through advertising to teenagers and advertising to adolescents was the idea of like a young adult created. And so now you see we have like young adult romance, young adult movies, PG-13 movies, like, and so it became a category like because of wanting to advertise to them and make money. Yeah.
Cool. I wanted to open it up to the audience. Does anyone out here have any questions? Anybody? Right here, yeah.
Hello.
Oh, damn. Okay.
Just like to feel out of place anywhere, but you mentioned that seeing the budget shocked you a little bit. I was wondering if there was anything that happened like during the course of production or like being on set that made you aware of your class or like maybe made you feel out of place?
So the question was for Tayler about her first film, the production of it, and if anything through being on set kind of highlighted her class position.
Not really, because, I mean, outside of like my producer, the people who had the money, my crew and my cast was made up of people from the same class background as me. It was like me and my friends from school. Like I went to Purchase, and there's like a huge film school there. So it was like my first AD was like my buddy from college kind of thing, which also speaks to just how low budget the film was, right? So when I was in pre-production, I was like, damn, that's a lot of money. And I tried to do it in a very ethical way. Like, we paid everyone, you know what I mean? So like, of course, these things started to add up. But for me, I was like, okay, that's a lot of money. And then when you're on set, what actually happens is you're like, oh, that's why that's a lot of money. You know what I mean? Okay, you have to make a company move. We had like 4 locations. We shot it over a weekend. Which, like, I know better now, you know, about certain aspects of that. But, like, you're like, oh, okay, so, like, that's why this costs this many, we have to feed this many people, that's why that's so expensive. And even that's like the bare minimum of what it actually costs on, like, a much bigger budget film. So, yeah, it was, like, it really kind of, if anything, gave me the space to kind of be in these conversations about money and know, like, no, you're lowballing me. That's low. You know what I mean? Like, that's a very low budget film. That's a lot of money for said film, and kind of knowing, you know, going forward too, like what to negotiate and being like, no, actually, I need more days, and if that inflates the budget by X amount of money, then that's just gonna have to be what it is because it's not gonna work in this other way. And I'm thankful for that experience. I'm thankful that I can kind of hopefully go up from here. So watch this space.
Yeah. Awesome. Anybody else? Questions? Anybody? Oh, way up here. Yeah, of course.
How much do you think we as consumers play a role in this gap? Both consuming, you said creative, but do we consume those kinds of films as people who attend film festivals? What responsibility do we have to sort of make that gap less of a gap?
I mean, that's, yes, the consumer sort of drives this, and the consumer that they're after is the 15-year-old who wants to go in Marvel movies. But that's a cultural shift, and so the consciousness of the culture has to shift, and how that happens, if I had that answer, I think I'd probably not be on this panel. but like what people like to go see, and again, like I do think there's a distinction to be made between like the audience for the Marvel movies or the audience for the Star Wars movies and the audience for the writer, for instance, or the audience for Uncut Gems. But that's a distinction that I think has been around for, like I said, for like 40 years. And so one of the things is also like, you know, what is this is going to turn into an economics discussion, but like what is the price point that you can make those things at? Like there's so much, my producer Mike was talking about this yesterday, like the pressure on our types of films, these sort of independent sort of art films, to make them cheaper and cheaper. So like to your, like what you're talking about in terms of budgeting, like and those people who could really be useful on your crew, but you can't afford them anymore, or you can only afford one person in an apartment, and we have to make them cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and it's because of the glut of, I hate this word, but the glut of content, because nobody knows that they're going to make their money back on your movie. The pressure gets more and more, it just gets more and more pressure-packed production-wise because of that.
Is there a real big difference between Marvel movie watchers and like our house and I don't know. I feel like also like something that isn't talked about as much is like these kind of like mid-budget studios have their own hives. Like A24 has a hive. You know what I mean? In the same way Marvel does. Like there are people waiting with like bated breath for them to drop a trailer of something new. But I think that, you know, and those films are, you know, not nearly as expensive as like these bajillion dollar. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's just really weird. The film industry is in a really weird place because also some of those studios get bought up by like Disney.
Sure.
Like these huge conglomerates. And so like those films aren't getting made nearly as much. But just, I feel like the consumer question is really interesting. But it kind of ties back to what I was saying is like if I'm spending $17, like wow me.
Yeah.
You know, I deserve that. I don't have that much money. I don't have that much time on a weekend. I work 5 days a week. I have Saturday and Sunday. If I'm going out and I'm giving you hours of my time, like fucking wow me. And I understand that kind of like compulsion, and but why also that's killing these like what we're saying.
Well, and I mean like I was talking about this before the talk. Like my students all want to know if I've seen the Joker, and I haven't, because I don't care. Like I'm not going to put down the $15 for it, right? But like for me, and this is because I'm an old man, but like I'm gonna go, like I'm waiting for Noah Baumbach's Marriage Story because I want to watch Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson yell at each other, right? That's wowing me, like, you know. But I'm an old man, and like I'm not
out on Netflix soon.
Yeah.
Marriage Story.
We have a question right here. Hi.
getting like the time, people giving them the time and the money to sit and watch them in a room talk, versus a brown or black filmmaker like making the demand of like, tell me how your culture works, tell me how you talk, tell me how you dress, show me the music you listen to. Like, you have to sort of come out, especially in the festival.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think
Like, well, you guys can talk about this more, but like, there's something to what Chris was saying in terms of like what people have been educated to think of as interesting or good or high art or aesthetically pleasing or whatever, and it could be that like those things are hitting those marks for those critics and those film festival programmers, and because they're talking in the same cultural space, I guess.
I'm not a fan of mumblecore. But yeah, I mean, look, who builds the canon, right? Who are the people that have typically been given the positions of power to engage with these works and say, this is phenomenal, this is it. So, you know, I mean, this also ties back to like diversity inclusion, which sometimes could feel like a very, like, you know, again, we're talking about this again, we know the answers, right? Like, I mean, none of this is new at all. But same thing with like conversations about representation. You're not wrong, that privilege is obviously there, that privilege has been called out. But at the end of the day, as long as these people maintain the positions of power that they have, if they look at that film and they're like, that's it, that's the film they're gonna put their money behind, you know? And I mean, I think that also comes in how I feel about my position, or what a little, you know, power I have as a critic or a person writing, you know, okay, well, maybe I can write a few words to that black film that's kind of flying under the radar, that, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. That filmmaker is dying to get out there. But yeah, I mean, I agree 1,000% about mumblecore. I'm like, this ain't it for me, but not to be an asshole or nothing, but I definitely agree, you know what I'm saying? But shout out to Baumbach though. Yeah, he got the game on lock, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like part of that also is just like, again, going back to how films are funded, and that the impetus for a lot of, especially independent films, falls on, will this rich financier say yes, or will they say no?
Yeah.
You know, and that we have this paradigm where the rich literally decide what films get made, and that's, you know, that's it, and everybody else can pool their resources together.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm curious, just maybe to close it off, what are some ways that filmmakers, and honestly writers as well, can pool together our resources and harness what we do have to make work on our own terms and get it seen?
Isn't that the like classic make movies with your friends thing? Which I guess, yeah. I mean, there's just a system in place, right? I mean,
Yeah,
like I said, you know, even when you're talking about like rich people funding, right? Like that's as old as like the Medicis, like, you know what I mean? Fucking commissioning Leonardo da Vinci to make paintings or whatever the fuck. Like, you know, it's not new at all. Even the idea of like these independent film movements that happen where it's like one person with the camera and you rotate the camera amongst your friends until you have this work. And then, you know, there's a history of it, but then also a lot of the way those people get acknowledged is like retroactively when we're 20 years away from that and we're like, oh, look at like the LA Rebellion, like, you know what I mean? Like that's literally people, that's solidarity. People in film school all working on each other's sets, you know, Charles Burnett like shooting Bless Their Little Hearts by Billy Woodbury and vice versa. But I mean, and they made an impact in their time. I'm not like taking it away in any sense, but these aren't people who have had these like long, illustrious careers either.
Yeah.
Because you have to, you have to play the game in some sense if you want that Hollywood breakthrough. You want to make a film every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. Yeah, I don't think, like, we were talking about, like, these things don't kind of, like, exist in a vacuum. You know what I mean? It's like I guess, at minimum, make your film and hope for the best. But there are, like, these kind of steps that need to be taken that if they aren't, you will not get that Marvel movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say, like, I made this thing about maybe film festivals don't matter, but I would say, like, what I've seen here at a place like Indie Memphis, where there's this consciousness of, like, no, we're going to try to represent people who are coming from different backgrounds that are not sort of funded in those same ways. That's definitely one way. Now, that's certainly not the norm, I think, on the circuit. But if, like, that kind of consciousness in the programming decisions, like, it's not just about. Because one of the things that you'll hear, like when you're submitting films, is, oh, well, we just pop the DVD in, or we play the link, and that's it. if there's this kind of awareness, and I mean, certainly you can tell by watching a film how much they have, what the resources were usually, but it's like, oh, this person is coming from this background, and they're not connected, and their dad wasn't an agent or something like that, you know, or a lawyer at a studio or something. That's one way, I think, and I think it speaks well for MD Memphis. That seems to be very much about part of their approach.
Yeah.
Shout out to MD Memphis. I love that they have like the hometowners
Yeah.
stuff.
Absolutely.
I love that. I stand. Also, shout out to Miriam Bell.
Yeah.
Woo.
Oh, yeah.
Miriam.
Right.
I don't think she's here. My bad. But
I don't think she's here.
yeah.
Are there any other questions in the audience anywhere? I guess we'll just leave it there.
Thank y'all
Cool.
for coming.
Thank you all so much.
Yay.